My son walked out of my hospital room while I was unconscious. His wife went with him. They packed up my house while I was on a ventilator, and by the time I woke up, they'd already changed the locks. I didn't know any of this at first, of course. When I finally opened my eyes after 4 days in the ICU, all I knew was that my chest hurt and my throat was raw, and there was a nurse checking my vitals. She smiled at me. She told me I'd had pneumonia that turned into sepsis. She said I'd been very sick. I asked where David was. My son. She said no one had been by that morning. That should have told me something right there. I'm 71 years old. I lived in a house my husband and I bought in 1981. 3 bedrooms, quiet street, paid off 15 years ago. Tom died 6 years back. Heart attack, sudden. And after that, it was just me in a house that felt too big and too quiet, but it was mine. I knew every creaking floorboard. I knew which cabinet hinge stuck. I knew where. The sun came through the kitchen window at 8 in the morning. David is my only child. He's 46. He married Stephanie when he was 30, and I'll be honest, I never warmed to her. She was polite enough at first, but there was always something calculating in the way she looked at things. At our house, at Tom's tools in the garage, at the antique cabinet my mother left me, she'd walk through rooms with her eyes moving over everything like she was taking inventory. Once, about a year after they got married, she asked me what I planned to do with my mother's jewelry. Not if she could have it, just what my plans were. I told her I hadn't thought about it. She said, "Well, you should. Things like that should stay in the family." I remember thinking that was an odd thing to say when I was only in my 50s and in perfect health. After Tom died, they started coming around more often, checking on me, they said. David would mow the lawn. Stephanie would bring groceries. I appreciated it at first. I really did. But then the conversation started. It began about a year after Tom's funeral. We were sitting in my living room. David said he'd been thinking about my situation. That's the word he used, my situation. He said the house was too much for me, too much upkeep, too much space. He said I should think about selling it and moving into a senior community, somewhere with less responsibility. I told him I wasn't interested. Stephanie jumped in then. She said they weren't trying to pressure me, they just worried. What if I fell? What if I got sick and no one was there? I said I had a phone. I said I had neighbors. David said, "Mom, we're just trying to help." I changed the subject, but it didn't stop. Every visit, there was some new angle. David mentioned how much the property taxes were. He said it didn't make sense for me to spend that much when I was on a fixed income. Stephanie talked about how dangerous it was for someone my age to live alone. She'd read an article about elderly people falling in their own homes. Then she started pointing out things that needed fixing: the loose railing on the back steps, the water stain on the ceiling in the guest room, the fence that was leaning. She'd say, "Margaret, you really should get this taken care of. What if you're liable if someone gets hurt?" I started dreading their visits. Every Sunday they'd show up around noon. David would walk through the house and find something to criticize. Stephanie would sit at my kitchen table and talk about how much easier my life would be if I just simplified. One Sunday, she brought brochures, glossy pamphlets for senior living communities. She spread them out on the table like she was showing me vacation destinations. She said, "Just look at these, Margaret. They have activities. They have nurses on staff. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. I told her I didn't need to look at them. She left them on my table anyway. Then, one afternoon, David brought over some paperwork. He said he'd been talking to a financial advisor. He said if I signed a quitclaim deed and transferred the house into his name, I could still live there, but it would protect the house from being taken if I ever needed Medicaid for a nursing home. He had the papers already filled out, my name typed in, a line for my signature. I didn't sign it. He looked hurt. He said, "I'm trying to protect your assets, Mom." I told him the house was staying in my name. Stephanie got quiet. She didn't say anything the rest of the visit, but I saw her exchange a look with David, a look that said they'd tried it the easy way. After that, the visits changed. They became shorter, colder. David stopped mowing the lawn. Stephanie stopped bringing groceries. When I called to ask if everything was okay, David said they were just busy. He said they had a lot going on. I asked what was going on. He said, "Just work stuff, money stuff. You wouldn't understand." That stung, but I let it go. A few weeks later, I got sick. It started as a cold, a cough. I felt tired, but I thought it was just age, just a bug going around. But then I started running a fever. I couldn't catch my breath. My chest felt tight. I tried to write it out. I didn't want to bother anyone. But on the third day, I couldn't get out of bed. I called David and told him I thought I needed to go to the hospital. He said he'd be right over. It took him 2 hours to get there. When he finally showed up, he looked annoyed, like I'd inconvenienced him. He drove me to the ER. I remember sitting in the passenger seat, feeling like my lungs were full of wet concrete. He kept glancing at me. He asked if I'd made a will, if everything was in order. I didn't answer. He asked if I'd talked to a lawyer recently. I said, "Well, David, I can barely breathe. Can we talk about this later?" He went quiet. They admitted me right away. Pneumonia in both lungs. My oxygen levels were low. They put me on antibiotics and oxygen and said they'd monitor me. David stayed for a little while. He asked the nurse a lot of questions about my condition, about how long I'd be there, about whether I'd put anyone down as my power of attorney. I hadn't. The nurse asked if I wanted to designate someone. She said it was good to have someone who could make medical decisions if I couldn't. David said, "I'm her son. I can do it." I told the nurse I'd think about it. David looked irritated. He said, "Mom, I'm here. I'm the logical choice." I said I'd think about it. He left that night. He said he'd come back in the morning. But I got worse. By the next afternoon, I was in the ICU. My breathing got so bad, they had to intubate me, put me on a ventilator. I don't remember much of that. Just flashes, lights, voices, the feeling of panic, and then nothing. I was unconscious for 4 days. When I woke up, the nurse told me I'd been very lucky. That sepsis could have killed me, that I'd turned a corner. I asked about David again. She checked the visitor log. She said no one had signed in to see me since the first day. I thought maybe he'd just gotten busy. Maybe he didn't know I was in the ICU. Maybe the hospital hadn't called him. But then my phone wasn't on the bedside table. I asked the nurse if anyone had brought my things from home. She said no. She said I'd arrived with just my purse. I asked if I could use a phone. I called David. He didn't answer. I called 3 more times that day, nothing. I called Stephanie, straight to voicemail. I lay there in that hospital bed with tubes in my arms and an oxygen mask on my face, and I wondered why my son wouldn't answer the phone. The next day, a hospital social worker came to see me. Her name was Linda. She was kind. She asked if I had family. I said I had a son. She asked if he'd been visiting. I said he'd been here the first day. She made a note. She asked if I had anyone else, friends, other family. I said I had neighbors. She asked if there was someone who could help me when I was discharged, someone who could stay with me for a few days. I said I'd figure it out. She looked concerned. She said, "Mrs. Porter, you're going to need help. You can't go home alone after this." I said I'd call my son. She said, "Would you like me to try calling him?" I said yes. She called from her office phone. David answered on the second ring. I heard her side of the conversation. She explained that I'd been very sick, that I was recovering, that I'd need support when I was discharged. She paused. She said, "I see. When do you think you'll be able to come by?" Another pause. She said, "Mr. Porter, your mother almost died." She hung up. She came back to my room. She said, "He said he'd try to come by this week." Try. I stayed in the hospital for another week, recovering, getting my strength back. Every day I called David. Every day it went to voicemail. I left messages. I said, "David, it's Mom. I'm still in the hospital. Can you call me back?" Nothing. I started to feel something I'd never felt about my son before. Not anger, not yet, just confusion, a deep, aching confusion about why he wouldn't talk to me. The nurses were kind. They brought me extra blankets. They helped me walk the halls when I got strong enough. One nurse, a young woman named Maria, asked me if I wanted her to call my son. I said no. I said it was fine. She said, it's not fine. You shouldn't be alone." But I was. A social worker came to talk to me about discharge planning. She asked if I had family who could help me at home. I said I had a son. She asked if he'd been in touch. I didn't know what to say. She suggested I might want to go to a rehab facility for a few weeks, just until I got stronger. I said I wanted to go home. She said, "I understand, but you'll need someone to check on you." I said I'd be fine. She didn't look convinced, but she couldn't force me to go to rehab. She gave me a list of home health agencies and told me to call if I needed anything. They discharged me on a Tuesday. The hospital arranged for a medical transport van to take me home since I couldn't drive yet. I was still weak, still on oxygen. The van pulled up to my house a little after 2 p.m. The first thing I noticed was that my front porch looked wrong. The planter I kept by the door was gone. The welcome mat was gone. The rocking chair I'd had for 20 years, gone. The driver helped me to the door. I reached for my keys. The lock didn't turn. I tried again. Nothing. I thought maybe I was using the wrong key, but no, it was the right key. The lock had been changed. My hands started shaking. I stood there on my own porch holding my oxygen tank, and I didn't understand what was happening. The driver asked if I had another way in. I said I didn't. He helped me check the back door, also locked, different lock. I looked through the windows. The living room was empty, no furniture, no curtains, just bare walls and carpet. The bookshelf where I kept Tom's photo, gone. The couch we'd bought in 1985, gone. The coffee table with the ring stain from where David used to set his juice cup when he was 7, gone. My legs almost gave out. The driver caught me. He said, "Ma'am, do you want me to call someone?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Call the police." 2 officers showed up 20 minutes later. I explained that I'd been in the hospital, that I'd come home to find my house empty and the locks changed. They asked if I had proof I lived there. I showed them my driver's license, my address. They asked if anyone else had access to the house. I said, my son, had a key. They asked if I'd given him permission to move my things. I said no. One officer said, ma'am, this sounds like a family dispute. We can't really get involved unless there's been a crime. I said, someone emptied my house. He said, but if it was your son and he had a key, then legally it's complicated. The other officer suggested I call my son. I said I'd been trying to call him for a week. They looked at each other. One of them said, do you want us to do a welfare check? I didn't know what that meant. He explained they could go to David's house and ask him to contact me. I said, yes, please. They left. They said they'd be in touch. I sat on my front steps with my oxygen tank beside me. The medical transport driver had left. I was alone. I didn't know what to do. I called David again. This time he answered. I said, David, what's going on? I can't get into my house. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, Mum, we need to talk, but not over the phone. I said, did you change my locks? He said, Stephanie and I have been trying to reach you. That was a lie. I had 15 missed calls to him on my phone. Not one returned call. I said, where is my furniture? He said, we're storing it. We'll explain everything. Where are you right now? I told him I was sitting outside my house. He said he'd come by. He showed up an hour later. Stephanie was with him. They parked in my driveway like it was theirs. David got out of the car and he looked calm. Too calm. Like he'd been expecting this. He said, Mom, let's go inside and talk. I said, I can't go inside. You changed the locks. He pulled out a key. He unlocked the door. I walked into my own house and it was empty. Completely empty. The walls where my pictures had hung. The spot where Tom's recliner used to be. The kitchen table we'd eaten at for 30 years. All of it. Gone. I could see the indentations in the carpet where the furniture had been. Rectangles and circles marking where my life used to be. I turned around and looked at him. I said, what did you do? Stephanie answered. She said, we were worried about you. You were in the hospital and no one knew if you'd make it. We had to make some decisions. I said, what decisions? David said, we moved your things into storage. We thought it would be easier. I said, easier for who? He didn't answer that. I said, why did you change the locks? Stephanie said, we needed to secure the house. I said, it's my house. David looked uncomfortable. He shifted his weight. He said, actually, Mum, that's what we need to talk about. He told me that while I was unconscious, they'd filed for emergency guardianship. He said because I didn't have a power of attorney and because I was incapacitated, they went to court and got temporary authority to make decisions on my behalf. I felt like I'd been hit in the chest. I said, you had no right. He said, we had every right. You could have died. Someone had to take charge. Stephanie added, we were protecting your interests. I said, by stealing my furniture? David said they didn't steal anything. He said they moved it to storage for safekeeping. He said they were in the process of selling the house. The room tilted. I grabbed the wall. I said, you can't sell my house. He said, we can. We're your legal guardians. And frankly, Mum, you can't afford to keep it. That's when Stephanie handed me a folder. Inside were documents, bank statements, bills, a letter from the court. David said, while you were sick, we went through your finances. You're behind on property taxes. You've been pulling from your savings to cover expenses. At the rate you're going, you'll be broke in 2 years. I said, that's my business. He said, not anymore. We're responsible for you now. I looked at the bank statements, my accounts, my private information I'd never given them permission to access. Stephanie said, we've already accepted an offer on the house. It closes in 3 weeks. I said, I didn't agree to sell. David said, you don't have to. We're your guardians. I felt my legs shaking. I sat down on the floor. There was nowhere else to sit. I said, when did you do this? When did you go to court? David said, the day after you were admitted to the ICU. I said, I was unconscious for 4 days. What was the rush? He said, we didn't know if you'd wake up. We had to act fast. Stephanie said, the court agreed with us. They saw the situation. I said, what situation? I had pneumonia. People recover from pneumonia. David said, you also had sepsis. Your organs were shutting down. The doctors didn't think you'd make it. I said, but I did make it. He said, that doesn't change the guardianship. I asked where I was supposed to live. Stephanie said they'd found a place for me, a senior facility about 40 minutes away. She said it was clean and safe and I'd have my own room. I said, I'm not going to a nursing home. David said it wasn't a nursing home. It was assisted living. I said, I don't need assistance. I just got out of the hospital. He said, exactly, you just got out of the hospital. You're not capable of living alone. Stephanie said, we've already put down a deposit. You move in next week. I said, I'm not going. David said, Mum, you don't have a choice. I told them to leave. David said we needed to finish the conversation. I said, get out of my house. Stephanie said, it's not your house anymore, Margaret. I looked at her. I said, what did you just say? She said, legally, the house is under David's guardianship, which means we make the decisions now. David tried to soften it. He said, Mom, we're doing this for you. I said, you're doing this for yourselves. He looked hurt, like I'd accused him of something terrible. I said, you waited until I was dying to take everything from me? He said, that's not fair. I said, you didn't visit me once, not once. While I was in the ICU fighting for my life, where were you? He didn't answer. Stephanie said, we were handling things. I said, you were emptying my house. They left, but they took the key with them. I stood in my empty living room and I cried for the first time since Tom died. I cried until I couldn't breathe, until my oxygen monitor started beeping. Then I stopped. I sat on the floor. I made myself breathe. And I decided I wasn't going to let them do this. I called a locksmith. He came out that same day. I had him change the locks again. It cost me $200. I moved back into my empty house. I had no furniture, no bed. I found a blanket in the linen closet they'd somehow missed. I slept on the floor that first night. I woke, sore and angry. The next morning, David called. He said I was being unreasonable. He said I was putting myself at risk. I told him if he came near my house again, I'd call the police. He said, you can't fight this, Mum. We went through the legal process. I said, we'll see about that. I hung up. I knew I needed help. I called a lawyer. His name was Alan Morris. He'd handled Tom's will years ago. I went to his office the next day. I brought the folder Stephanie had given me. Alan looked through it. He looked at the guardianship papers. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Margaret, this is bad. I said, can they really do this? He said, they already did it. Emergency guardianship can be granted quickly if someone is incapacitated. The problem is you're not incapacitated anymore. I said, so what do I do? He said, we file to terminate the guardianship. We show the court that you're competent and capable, but it takes time. I said, how much time? He said, a few weeks, maybe a month. I said, they're selling the house in 3 weeks. He rubbed his face. He said, then we need to move fast. Alan said he'd file an emergency motion to halt the sale. He said it wasn't guaranteed, but it was worth trying. I paid him a retainer, $1,500. It wiped out most of what I had left in checking. He said, I'm going to need you to do something for me. I said, what? He said, I need you to get a medical evaluation from your doctor stating that you're mentally and physically capable of living independently. I said I'd do it. I went to my doctor that afternoon, Dr. Hansen. I'd been seeing her for 10 years. I explained what had happened. She was shocked. She said, Margaret, you're competent. You're recovering well. There's no reason you can't live at home. I asked if she'd put that in writing. She said, absolutely. She wrote a detailed letter. She included my test results, my cognitive function, my recovery timeline, everything. She handed it to me and she said, I'm sorry this is happening to you. I thanked her. A week went by. Alan filed the motion. We got a court date. But David's lawyer argued that the sale should proceed because I'd been financially irresponsible and the house was a burden. They presented my bank statements. They showed that I'd been pulling money from savings. I tried to explain that I'd had to pay for Tom's funeral, that I'd had some unexpected medical bills, that I'd been careful. The judge didn't look convinced. David's lawyer said, Your Honor, Mrs. Porter is 71 years old. She's living in a house she can't afford. She almost died. Her son is trying to protect her. Alan argued that I had a right to make my own decisions. That guardianship was meant to be a last resort. The judge said she'd take it under advisement. The sale wasn't stopped. I felt defeated. I went home to my empty house. I sat on the floor and I didn't know what to do. Then my doorbell rang. It was my neighbor, Carol. She'd lived 2 doors down for 20 years. She said she'd seen the moving truck the week I was in the hospital. She said she'd thought it was strange that David and Stephanie were clearing out the house when I was still alive. She said she'd taken pictures, photos of them loading furniture into a truck, photos of them carrying out boxes, photos of Stephanie wrapping my mother's cabinet in blankets, time-stamped, dated to the days I was unconscious in the ICU. She said, I didn't know if it mattered, but something felt wrong. They were rushing. They looked nervous. And when I asked David if you were okay, he wouldn't look at me. I asked if I could have copies. She said yes. She handed me a folder full of printed photos. Timestamps clear. Evidence. I brought the photos to Alan. He looked at them carefully. He spread them out on his desk. He said, this is good. This shows they were acting while you were incapacitated, but it also shows they were moving quickly, possibly too quickly. He said he wanted to dig into the guardianship petition itself. He requested the full file from the court. When it came back, Alan found something. In the petition, David had stated that I had no significant assets other than the house. He'd claimed I was destitute and unable to manage my affairs. But that wasn't true. I had a savings account, a small IRA. Not a fortune, but enough to live on if I was careful. David knew about it. He'd even helped me set it up years ago. Alan said he lied to the court. He understated your assets to make it look like you needed a guardian. I said, why would he do that? Alan said, because if you had assets, the court might have asked more questions. This made it look urgent, like you were helpless. He said, this is misrepresentation, possibly fraud. We filed an amended motion. This time, we included the photos from Carol. We included my bank statements showing I had funds. We included the letter from Dr. Hansen. We included proof that David had lied on the guardianship petition. Alan also subpoenaed David's financial records. David's lawyer fought it, but the judge ordered them turned over. That's when we found it. 3 days after the guardianship was granted, David had taken out a personal loan. $50,000, using my house as collateral. He'd forged my signature on the paperwork. Alan showed me the documents. My signature, or something that looked like my signature, on a loan application dated while I was on a ventilator. He said, this isn't just guardianship abuse, this is fraud. I felt sick. I said, why would he need $50,000? Alan said, that's what I want to know. He dug deeper. He found credit card debt in David and Stephanie's names, tens of thousands of dollars, maxed out cards, collection notices. They were broke, and they'd seen my house as their way out. We went back to court. This time the judge listened. David's lawyer tried to argue that the loan was for my benefit, that it was to cover my medical expenses, but Alan showed that my medical bills had been covered by Medicare. He showed that none of the loan money had gone to me. The judge asked David directly where the money went. David stammered. He looked at Stephanie. She looked away. He said, some of it went to pay off credit cards. Some of it went to, I don't know, living expenses. The judge said, living expenses? Your mother was in the ICU and you took out a loan against her house to pay your credit cards? David said, I was going to pay it back. The judge said, with what money? He didn't answer. She terminated the guardianship immediately, right there in the courtroom. She ordered the sale of the house to be cancelled. She referred David to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges, and she ordered him to return every piece of furniture, every piece, and every item he'd taken from my house within 14 days. Stephanie stood up and said, Your Honor, some of those items were gifts. The judge said, do you have receipts? Stephanie didn't answer. The judge said, then they weren't gifts. It took 2 weeks, but I got my furniture back. Most of it. Some pieces were missing. David claimed they'd been lost in storage. My mother's jewelry, gone. He said he didn't know where it was. A set of china that had been in my family for generations, gone. Tom's coin collection, gone. I didn't believe him, but I didn't have the energy to fight over every item. I had my house, I had my life back. That was enough. The district attorney did press charges. David was charged with forgery and financial exploitation of an elderly person. He tried to plead not guilty, but the evidence was overwhelming. He took a plea deal. He got 2 years probation and had to pay restitution, all $50,000 plus court costs. Stephanie filed for divorce 6 months later. I heard she moved out of state. I haven't spoken to David since the last court date. He tried to call once, about 3 months after everything was finalized. I saw his name on the caller ID. I stared at it. I let it ring. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. He said, Mom, I know you're angry. I know I messed up, but I'm still your son. Can we talk? I deleted it. I don't know if I'll ever forgive him. I don't know if I should. He's my son. I raised him. I loved him. I thought he loved me. But he looked at me lying in a hospital bed and he saw an opportunity. He didn't see his mother fighting for her life. He saw a house he could sell, assets he could take, a problem he could solve for himself. And that's something I can't forget. I still live in my house. I had the locks changed one more time just to be sure. I'm more careful now about who I trust. I set up a living trust and a durable power of attorney with Alan as my agent, not family. I put everything in writing, every asset, every account, every piece of property, so that if something happens to me, there's a record, there's protection. I see Carol more often now. She checks on me. I check on her. We have coffee on Thursday mornings. We don't talk about what happened much. We just talk about normal things, the weather, the news, her grandkids. We're not waiting for someone to care. We're doing it ourselves. I joined a support group for elder abuse survivors. I didn't think I'd need it, but I went to one meeting and I heard other people's stories and I realized I wasn't alone. There were others who'd been taken advantage of by their children, by their spouses, by people they trusted. One woman's daughter had drained her entire savings account. Another man's son had forged his name on a reverse mortgage. We sat in a circle in a community center and we told our stories. And nobody judged. Nobody said we should have seen it coming. Nobody said we were stupid for trusting family. Because family is supposed to be the people you can trust. I think about what David said that day in my empty house, that he was trying to protect me, that he had every right. Maybe he even believed it at first. Maybe he told himself he was doing the right thing, that I couldn't handle things on my own, that he was being a good son. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about me. It started being about him, about his debts, about his problems, about his needs. And I became a means to an end. I've learned some things from all this. I've learned that you can't assume love means honesty, that you can't assume family means safety. I've learned that vulnerability is dangerous, that being sick, being old, being alone, these things make you a target, even to the people who should protect you. I've learned to read paperwork carefully, to ask questions, to never sign anything without understanding it completely. And I've learned that you have to advocate for yourself because sometimes nobody else will. But I've also learned that there are good people, people like Carol who paid attention when something seemed wrong, people like Alan who fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself, people like Dr. Hansen and Maria, the nurse, and Linda, the social worker, people who saw me as a person, not an asset, people who cared. I don't have much advice to give. I'm just a woman who almost lost her home to her own son. But I'll say this, pay attention to who shows up when you're vulnerable, not who says the right things, who actually does them. Because sometimes the people who say they're protecting you are the ones you need protection from. And sometimes the people who barely know you will be the ones who save you. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a like. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, you can subscribe. Have you ever had someone close to you betray your trust? I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments.